Yes.
All right, well then, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar for topic 4, design for online and blended learning. It's lovely to have you all in the room. It's lovely to see many of the organizing faces in the room too, alongside our participants. So welcome to you all. This afternoon, we are really very fortunate to have the expertise and the personality that Martin Weller is. He's a professor of educational technology in the Institute of Educational Technology at the Open University in the UK. And he's currently chair of the Open program, the Open University's flexible and multidisciplinary degree, which is the largest undergraduate degree program in the UK. Those of you who have followed Martin in Twitter or on his blog, the EdTechieNet, you'll know that he is one who shares a great deal with those of us who are in this space. He's the author of The Battle for Open, The Digital Scholar, and 25 years of EdTech, which maintains, and he obviously maintains his popular blog. He developed the first online course for the Open University back in 1999, which attracted over 15,000 students annually. And he was the director of Open University's Learning Design program, where he developed a range of innovative courses at an undergrad and postgrad level, and including MOOC. So it really is wonderful, Martin, that you've agreed to come back and present in this session, where we will hand over to you. If there are questions that anyone has as we move through Martin's presentation and engagement, please feel free to add those questions or comments in the chat. And then as we move to the end of the presentation, we'll pick up those questions and Martin will engage with you on that. So on that note, I hand over to Martin.
Thanks very much, Anne. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here again. I did this for the first time last October, November, and it was a really good session. So it's great to be invited back. Obviously, didn't mess up too badly then to be invited back. So I'm going to share my presentation with you. Hopefully this will work. We had a little test beforehand. Is that okay? You can see that, everybody? Good. So I'm going to talk about learning design at the Open University. And I need to kind of just stress that I'm not trying to say that the way we do it at the Open University is the only way to do it or even the best way to do it. I kind of think it's just good to share our experience as an institution, how it's been useful for us. I think there might be some resonance and connections that you can make with that work. We can discuss other approaches hopefully as well. So did that advance? We're getting the overview slide. Is that working? Someone give me a thumbs up.
Yes.
Are you seeing? Cool, great, yeah. Thanks. Sorry, I'm only checking because the last time I did a Zoom presentation, the slides didn't advance. Thanks, everyone. So this is what I want to talk about in this session. So why we developed learning design at the Open University in the UK. So what was our kind of motivation for adopting it? Some of the benefits of adopting a learning design approach. Then I'll talk about our particular approach and some of the tools we've developed. Then I want to talk about some examples of where it's been useful for us at the institution. And then lastly, I'll leave you with some tools that you can go and try and explore. And we can then hopefully have some questions and discussion. Sorry. So yeah, I'm going to first start off with what is learning design, thinking about what it means for us and how it's defined. So like many terms in higher education, there are many different definitions of it, and you can probably spend whole conferences arguing about what's your definition of learning design, and I think sometimes that can distract from what you mean from it. I also think it's the type of term that people have almost an innate sense of what it means, that you hear the term learning design and you think you know what it means, and that's probably good enough actually. I think in North America, people tend to use instructional design much more, and the two are perhaps synonymous, perhaps not. Again, we can argue that. So anyway, I've gone for this definition from the JISC, which are a UK body, which is the practice of planning, sequencing and managing learning activities, usually using ICT-based tools to support both design and delivery. So it's really, I think that just the idea is to explicitly bring a design focus to what you want to do. And I think that, although we could say that applies to everything, I think usually there's been this emphasis on using digital technology. And I think it's important to realize that it can be applied at all levels of learning. So you can apply learning design to one particular activity, to maybe a week's worth of activity, to a whole course or module, to a curriculum you want to apply, or even to a whole kind of qualification strand. So you can bring it in at many different levels of granularity. The learning design sort of approach really grew out of software design, I think, and so that means there are kind of a number of assumptions with it. One was that you kind of take a user perspective, and in this case we mean learners. So what's it like for the learner to go through that process? And you really want to try and make design decisions explicit. I think that's the most important part. And I think I'll come on to this later, but when we're teaching face-to-face in standard lectures and seminars and those kind of things, we often are doing a learning design approach, but I don't think we often realize it in a way, because that's the kind of default mode of operation. You have so many lectures for a semester and maybe some seminars, and that's just kind of how you go, and that's what you do. So really, you don't think about how you're designing that whole structure and what's the best use of those things. Often it's just a kind of default mode of working. And so I think that the point about learning design is to really sort of take a step back from that before you sort of jump straight into the way of thinking of, I've got 10 lectures to fill up kind of thing, but thinking, what's the best way to teach this topic? Slide. Okay, so why did we adopt it at the Open University? We had a kind of aim. We wanted to help the course design process. So the Open University, I should emphasize, is a completely distance learning university. We don't have face-to-face lectures. We were founded in 1969, so we sort of came from a tradition of producing print-based material for students to study at a distance, often asynchronously, with the support of face-to-face tutorials and maybe summer schools. So we sort of developed this way of producing our courses over the years. And I'll come on to why we felt we needed to revisit that. But we wanted to try and help this course design process by coming up with a set of tools that really helped us think about a kind of student activity way of thinking. And I think was an important switch for us in many ways. And this was the kind of context that made us come to that decision. So creating courses was in many ways becoming more complex for us. And that was really because there was so much more technology to use. We kind of had got used to using a lot of the, if you like, the kind of analog technologies. We knew about printed units. We used to have videotapes and audio tapes at summer schools. And then we used to have TV programs. And later we moved to maybe CD-ROMs and simulations. But then with the arrival of the internet in particular, we could start having online tutorials, online group work, of course, a number of different resources we could use online, how much of the course was printed or delivered online. So there was we did a survey of staff and wanted to sort of get their feelings about the course design process. And these were some of the findings that came out. And generally, staff agreed that there was a need for a clearer method of representing the structure and the key content of a course. And people had a strong belief, our academic staff had a strong belief in the educational potential of technology, but they weren't very confident that this potential was being kind of realised. And I think many staff felt overwhelmed by the challenge of kind of integrating all these different technologies in courses. And I think it's important to think about that for staff. So our staff had become experts at designing open university courses in a particular way. And then new technology comes along. In some ways that can almost seem deprofessionalizing and challenge some of your assumptions. And I think that's also true for staff who are experts at giving lectures and face-to-face tutorials, and they feel challenged about online learning. So I think you have to be very sensitive about the context within which you're trying to operate. So we wanted to try and support the design process at the university. So this was how we sort of went about it. So we introduced a consistent structured design. So what it meant was, when you're designing a course, here are the tools you use, and everyone uses the same tools. So we could then specify what a course looked like within those tools. And it also gave us a review process to say, this is what we intended the course to do. Is that what it actually did? And we wanted to provide a simple set of tools that everyone could use. You didn't have to become an expert in learning design to use the tools. I think a really interesting point was to try and reveal the costs and performance outcomes of design decisions. And I've got a few sort of anecdotal evidences and stuff, but I think often when we were designing courses, people would get very excited about doing something interesting or innovative, or perhaps filming a sequence of videos that required them to fly to exotic locations to deliver. But we didn't really know whether they were effective for students or not. And I think by saying this is what this resource is meant to do, we can then map onto whether it actually achieves that. And I'll come on later to talk about how we bring in some of the analytics as well to kind of back up that learning design approach. The next one is kind of a bit of a cliche, so everyone says this, kind of put student activity at the focus of the design process. People often talk about student-centered design, or putting the learner at the center. And I think you have to think, what is that in comparison to having the learner at the periphery? Maybe the learner's always at the center. But I think perhaps one way to think about that is to go back to that original point I made about having lectures and how many you might do that. We kind of had an equivalent at the Open University where we would sit down in course teams often at the start of a course design process and think about the content we were going to have. We'd think about how many printed units we were going to have, whether we'd have a summer school, those things. But we didn't really think about that from the student perspective as much. We really thought about it in terms of a production model. What were the things that we were going to produce and make? So I really think the learning design process just helped shift some of the emphasis to put the learner kind of more forefront in people's thinking. It provides a shared language for people around the university, and we operate very multidisciplinary teams. There'll be people who are experts in the academic content, but also those in student support or designing multimedia, all this. And I think having a shared language that people could talk to and communicate with was really important. And that similarly enables the sharing of best practice. So when it's wrapped up in the content, if you like, it's difficult to kind of extract that across disciplines. So by talking in a learning design language, we could say, okay, I want to find a good project-based course that might be in the languages department, and I'm in social sciences, but it's not wrapped up in the content of languages. I can extract what the good design elements are. And it would support faculty teams in choosing and integrating new technologies and media. And I'll come on to how we do that. Also, it's a learning design is also a useful tool then to help us realize other innovations that will come along, for instance, with MOOCs and other sort of free open online courses. We use the learning design process to come up with a standard way of developing those. Okay, so here's our approach. So the products we produced were an activity planner, and I'll talk about that in a minute, which sort of sets out the different things that a student might be doing. We produced a range of activities to work with these tools with course teams, such as they might sit down and run through a number of different cards and things. I'll talk about those later, and a number of tools for them to play with. And these tools were realised through a number of ways. First of all, we started off with a really, I thought this was a really important thing to do, and I really pushed for it. Was a paper pack, and it came in a nice little plastic envelope and everything. And inside were these tools like activity planner and your content planner. And the point about that was, I think it's quite important sometimes to have people sitting around a table together and saying, I want this to go there. And someone will say, no, that wouldn't work. We need to put that there. Just having a shared artifact that they worked with. And we also then developed some really nice software tools for the activity planner and other things that allowed you to visualize the structure of your course. I'll show some of those in a minute. And on the back of this, we could then develop an exemplar library which allowed that sharing of best practice. But to back this up, it was very important to have a staff support process. We do have a learning design team who can run workshops for module teams or faculties, or to deal with particular issues. So it's not just here's some tools, kind of off you go, but there's a kind of very structured staff support process. So I think when we implemented learning design, we did a review of how it went, and I think and we had some really good feedback for this, and this is some of the feedback we had. So curriculum managers are people who kind of look after the overall curriculum, and this person said it's been really positive for them. It kind of helps that kind of those early workshops we had really sort of helped get a kind of shared vision of what people wanted to do. And I think the module team chair, so that's the person who looks after the whole of a module production. Their quote, I think, is quite important. Is that they started from a different point of view. They didn't. They kind of had a shared understanding, and I think that's actually really important. And this goes back to that point about making design decisions explicit. I've worked in many course teams, module teams at the university, and it's quite interesting. Sometimes you'd be our courses can take quite a long time to produce, like a year, 2 years, and you'd be quite a long way into that production process, and you think you will have a shared understanding of what a course is, of what the course is you're designing, and actually someone will say something and you'll think they've got a completely different view of this course than I have, and you think, wow, I didn't realize that. It's like it's not that either view is right or wrong, but it's because you've been operating on assumptions that hadn't been made explicit. And I think the learning design process really helps make those decisions clearer. So you're kind of operating from a different basis. And this person was an associate dean, so the person in charge of their learning and teaching their faculty, and saying that's really kind of helped them think about it pedagogically, but also financially, and then that could help the student experience. So we had a number of principles. One was that it was pedagogy neutral. We weren't trying to emphasize or promote a particular pedagogy. This wasn't a way to implement, project-based learning as the only way of going or anything. So it's pedagogy neutral. We weren't sort of casting judgments on anyone's pedagogy. And we started with the student activity. So as I've mentioned, making that kind of foregrounded in people's thinking. It was really important to integrate it into standard practice. And I worked for a long time with what's called our stage gate approval process. So whenever anyone proposes a new course, it has to go through a kind of clear sequence of decision making. There has to be a business case for it. And within that, there's a point where they have to undertake the learning design process. And getting it integrated into that formal process within the university was actually really important for making it a kind of universal thing. And in many ways, that was the most difficult and perhaps the most boring aspect of it, working with your institutional structures and processes. It's not always exciting and engaging, and you go through lots of endless meetings to try and get that to happen. But actually, it's the really important part to get done, I think. We wanted it to be a space that wasn't kind of just what we might call a tick box exercise. I've got to do it. Yes, I've done that. Yes, I've done that. But really a space that encouraged people to feel creative and innovative and to explore these decisions. And then once you had the design, that would facilitate the production process, so the bit where it kind of goes into formal production. That's kind of fairly easy to do because you've made all these decisions over here, and then it's just a matter of producing them. So I think I mentioned some of the stuff already. So having that standard framework, because we'd made it part of that academic practice, so now I'm doing for time, that's okay, meant you could then share good practice. So it wasn't that each discipline, each faculty was doing different things. They kind of all operated to the same approach. But also acted then as a conduit for other teaching related projects, really just a way of framing things you wanted to do. So I'll come on to some of these later, but for instance, we wanted to do work on how to improve retention, and having learning design meant we could then think about how can we use the learning design approach to improve retention of students. And it allowed for a quality audit. We could say these are the design decisions we made here, this is why we made them very clearly, and also allowed us then to review the processes as well. So there are a number of kind of institutional benefits as well. Okay, so I mentioned we had an activity planner. A lot of this grew out of the work from Grania Knoll. I think you may have read some of her work. So Grania led on a lot of the work at the Open University, and I worked with her. So we tried to come up with a set of 6 activities, and we've got 7 here because we also included assessment, but the first 6 are the main ones, about what it is we're expecting a student to be doing at any time when we're designing an activity. So we use these categories, which are assimilative. So that's when you might be reading something, watching something, really taking in information, finding and handling information. And so these are examples of the types of verbs you might use to describe these things. So if someone was listing something, analysing something, that's doing something with information. Communication, this might be having a discussion or a debate within a forum. Productive is where the student's producing something, like writing something, creating something. Experiential, that's probably more drawing on particularly a number of vocational courses we have, for example, training of nurses, where they're kind of trying to draw on their own experience, or in business schools. Interactive or adaptive might be when, for instance, when we're using simulations or asking people to conduct experiments, those kind of things. And lastly, there's assessment, which is the kind of formal assessment. So the idea is that you should be able to predict what you want students to be doing at any stage in your system, in your activities. So here's a kind of example of what you might be doing. And so say you were thinking about planning a course over several weeks. You could then break down what it is the students are doing and think about the number of hours they're spending on that within your course. So they might be in week 1, 7 hours of assimilative, 1 hour of finding and handling information, and so on. So you could think about what it is you're asking students to do. And an interesting thing we did then was we went back and we got people to map existing courses, so courses that are already out there, and say using these categories and what the course team are directing people to do, how would you categorize these courses? And you can see there's quite a so we took different courses here, so one from law, one from science, one from Spanish. So across disciplines there might be quite a range. So it's probably not a surprise that in languages there's more productive or communication going on. People are kind of creating things to kind of share their knowledge. In general science, there's maybe a bit more interactive and adaptive because people are doing experiments. Whereas in law, it seems to be there was a lot of taking in of information. So I want to give some examples of what we've done with that. So once we had the kind of framework, we could then use learning design as a means of addressing a number of issues we wanted to work with module teams about. So for example, retention, making sure students finished a module. Workload within the module, how much were students actually being asked to do, whether we wanted to use social media within a module production or incorporate open educational resources, addressing issues around diversity and inclusion, and perhaps kind of more exploratory open pedagogies such as students as creators. And those things. Well, at least we had a kind of universal language we could use these things to explore them with. So one of the things we worked with was also the analytics team. So what we tried to do was look at some of the designs we had, the learning design material, and then draw across that with some of the student satisfaction data we had from our own surveys and student performance data, to see which kind of design features were having an impact and perhaps ones which won't. And when you're operating at a distance, this kind of data is actually quite difficult to get because there's a real delay between the course going out and getting feedback from it and then the next production going through. It's not the same as when you're given a lecture, say, and you can tell if students are being really bored or something. So there's kind of like this idea of a virtuous circle of analytics and design. So analytics give us a better understanding of student learning and behaviour, and we can interpret that against the pedagogical intent and content, which allows us to design for learning. Also, we can read it the other way around. We design for learning, we interpret that against that, and then we understand it through the behaviour. So we kind of the two feedback on each other, and I'll give some examples of how we've done. So one thing we wanted to look at was student workload. So you may think kind of workload's a fairly easy thing to do and to map. It becomes particularly problematic, I think, at a distance or online. So what we did was we did a workload mapping of 11 existing courses at the Open University, and we used that those categories I showed, assimilative, information handling, and so on, to kind of map that workload, and then we estimated times per activity to give us a kind of a weekly guide. And the results, I think, were quite surprising to everybody involved, including the module teams. So I'm just going to try and close that down so I can see. Yeah. So one thing, so this is an example, and we use some metrics, about if there's a word count, what the rough kind of reading speed is for people, so how long it would take to read that kind of material and so on. So over on the left here, so block 1 would be the first block of a module. Here's all the different things that make up that module. So there's a module guide, which is kind of a rough overview, all the activities, so on. And you can see we then would map the cumulative hours over on the right-hand side. And we would use the learning design outcomes then categories to see how long people are spending in each of the types of categories. So week 1 here, in this course, they're spending 5.3 hours doing assimilative work, 0.5 in communication, and so on. And from this, we could produce a weekly chart of the student workload. And again, you can see it's broken down by those different categories of what people are actually doing. And I think there's interesting things to note here. The first is it's by no means an even breakdown across the module, and that became a really sort of interesting point. And similarly, the types of activities vary quite a bit. So here, these were just the module codes over on the left. And the average weekly workloads. You can see they vary quite a reasonable amount between modules. So what's the lowest one there? 5.05 up to 9 hours. So there's quite a big variation. The workload spread is also quite important here. So it's not just whether the average weekly workload is high or low, but also how much it varies for students. So if one week they're doing 4 hours and the next week 9 hours, that's quite difficult to accommodate. And then we began to look at some of the data we had. So question 35 in our survey is the ability to keep up. And so then we could correlate that against workload. And also then we had the completion rates and the pass rates for people. So we could then map performance data against the workload data. I hope this is all making sense. So here's a graph that's fairly telling, I think. So this takes that question about the ability to keep up. You can see there's as workload increases, the ability to keep up decreases. There's a clear sort of decline there. And similarly, as workload increases, the the ability for people to complete, so the performance data declines as well. And workload distribution is that, the variation, standard deviation in workload. So how much it varies. It's not necessarily whether it's high or low, but just does it vary a lot between weeks? And again, there's a kind of a clear correlation between the more it varies, then that has an impact on whether students complete a course or not. So here's an example of of poor distribution of workload. So it goes from 10.6 down to 4.72 1 week. So that's difficult for students to plan their time and accommodate it appropriately. This is a more balanced workload. You can see it's kind of roughly around the same amount, 4 to 5 hours a week. So what this then allowed us to do was to go back to the module teams and say, there's some things you can do about this, and they could then take effective action. So one was, we have part-time tutors who support the students. So the tutors could say, we could tell the tutors about this, and they could then warn students, watch out for week 5. It's quite a busy week, so make sure you're planning for that in advance. And also the module team then made an effort to reduce some of that workload down to a kind of more manageable level. So it allowed us then to start to complete that circle. And another project we did was thinking about student retention. There's usually, despite all our best efforts, there's usually a higher dropout rate for students studying at a distance than at face-to-face universities for a number of reasons. And sometimes that's beyond your control. That's because they live, a lot of our people have jobs as well at the same time. A lot of our students have jobs and personal lives, they're carers and things like that. So, often those things are just beyond your control as a module team. But what we wanted to look at was what the design decisions we make that might help us keep students. So we did all these things to look at it. We kind of did an internal review, and this is, but perhaps it's just the Open University, but I suspect it's typical of many universities. We found, I think, 42 different projects that were looking at some way at retention across the university. Of course, none of these projects were talking to each other. So that we did a kind of internal review of what's happening, an external review of what the research in this area says, interviews with module teams to say, what are their issues around this, an analysis of SEAM as our student survey, an analysis of the comments that people have made about, particularly for students who had dropped out, students who haven't completed the course, and comparison of the design of high and low retention modules, so modules that had really good retention and modules that often lost students. So we kind of combined all these things to come up with a model. There were some findings from this. I won't go into all of these. Some of this is kind of beyond learning design. But from this, we could draw a number of kind of conclusions. And the important thing was, having got these findings, we could then turn to learning design and think, how can we help module teams design their courses better to improve retention? So we developed this iceberg model, and we said a well-designed module for retention needs to have these 7 elements. So it needs to be integrated, collaborative, engaging, balanced, economical, reflective, and gradual. And so I won't go through those, what each of those means. So balanced is, again, goes back to workload. Engaging means getting students to feel like they're engaged quite early on and those things. And what this allowed us to do then was to, particularly where module teams were saying they were having problems with retention, we could go in with learning design approaches and say, okay, these are the things you need to think about and work with, and let's look at the structure of your course currently in the learning design. So we came up with these tips, but they could then be implemented in learning design. So things like engaging students early on in the module, that's that point about being engaged. Look for potential, what we call retention black spots. So like, there are some things that you might want to do, even though they might cause students to drop out. And I think group work is a good example of that. Students often don't like group work, and it's particularly difficult to realise at a distance or online. But nevertheless, it's a good thing for them to do, and there's lots of pedagogic reasons for doing it. So I think what there's, just by knowing that these things might cause students to drop out or feel anxious to say, look, this thing's coming up over here. It might be tough, but stick with it. It's going to be okay. You know, think about these things, give yourself extra time, whatever. I mentioned one from workload. Make sure all the materials, resources, media are easy to access. And that sounds obvious, but there's nothing more frustrating for students when, like you said, I'll go over here and I can't get to that, or I can't find this thing that you told me to go to. Breaking up modules into shorter chunks, so the students began to feel they were getting somewhere. It wasn't like our modules last for 32 weeks. Sometimes it's like I can feel like a long slog. So I kind of breaking it up into kind of more rewarding chunks. You know, it gives students some sense of satisfaction they're going along. Give students time for self-assessment and formative assessments. They kind of see how they're doing and get some sense of where they are. But lots of our students haven't studied before, and they're not sure, am I doing the right thing? So it's kind of rewarding for them to know you're doing well, this is good. Making assessment relevant, interesting, challenging, and even fun. You know, it doesn't feel like you're just doing assessment for the sake of it. Some of the stuff is very breaking up the study planner on a week-by-week basis rather than bigger chunks, and building in revision and assessment skills that allow students to kind of develop their study skills and time for reflection. And we kind of having room for all these things within a module can really help improve retention. And we've been through some processes now. So by having the learning design at the start, we can say, which of these are you not doing currently and how can we help you implement them more effectively? So I said I'd give out some tools. And so some of the work we do with module teams early on, one is around the idea of personas. So we've got this kind of template for personas, and you can download this content from there. And the idea with personas, I don't know if maybe you've done some work on this already, but the idea is to really think of a particular student and to try and sort of flesh them out as realistically as possible. So you ask all these kind of questions about things like, what's their living situation like? What are their practical needs? Why are they studying with you? What are they hoping to get from it? What are their weaknesses and strengths? And those kind of things. And it just helps you try to not see all. So we develop a few of these between a module team and try not just to think of all students as one amorphous mass kind of thing. And so also I think it's very good to kind of get other people involved in these, students themselves, to design these, and not to kind of just fall into stereotypes. To try and think of students who might want to take your course but are a bit different from the kind of stereotype of that course, and think about, does my course work for this person? And this is something you can then return to as you're going through the module design process. You can say, well, would that course work for persona X? And the idea is to give them names, you know, you go, oh yeah, maybe they wouldn't like that, or maybe they would struggle with understanding this part from where they're from. So we have these activity planners, which you can print out, you know, the paper versions. So again, this is where you can use those categories and also include the learning outcomes there and how you're meeting those. We have an activity design template as well. So for any specific activity, talk about what its purpose is, you know, what the steps in it and the timings, kind of taking that design process down to the smallest unit, if you like, of a particular activity. Some of the things I really like are these cards. So we have a number of activities around these things. So we have cards for representing academic skills that might be like critical thinking, you know, essay writing, those kind of things, or a number of different academic skills. We have some for digital information literacy, so have ability to find information, employability skills that are developed, and we have these at different levels across the undergraduate level and at postgraduate. And we also have a number of different activities that module teams can do with these. So one of the things I really like, we have this activity where a number of kind of key words that come from different areas. So one might be around pedagogy, others might be around technology, and they include words like innovative, you know, project-based, or something. And we ask module teams to, I think there are 40 odd of these cards. We ask module teams, like each member of the module team, to choose the 10 or whatever it is, the cards that best represent the module that you want to design. and then rank them in order in a priority list. And that simple exercise really brings out some key differences in module teams working. So I remember working with module team, and someone had put innovative at the top, and someone else said, like, our module's not innovative. We don't want to be innovative. And it's kind of clear they had very different perceptions of what the module's doing. And I think just going back to that earlier point I made about making design decisions explicit, just having those discussions early on really helps surface an understanding of what the module is going to be about. We also have a number of resources in terms of guides and just advice. So advice on taking design approaches to developing collaborative activities, employability, retention, inclusive curriculum, and active learning that might be useful for you all. And so I'm getting near the end. I hope I've had enough time for discussion yet. So I thought the things you might want to discuss, but I'm open to anything else. I won't pretend it was all easy going implementing learning design. I once had to go and deliver a learning design workshop to a particular faculty. I won't say which one, but I was lucky to escape alive, I think is the one way. But they were very hostile to it. You know, don't come and tell us how to design courses. This doesn't work here, not for our discipline. What was interesting after that, a year later, they came back to us and said, we're having real problems with one of our modules. We're losing lots of students. And they said, so, you know, that learning design, that stuff you were talking about, could you come and help us with that? So it kind of, it took some time for them to understand it. So I think sometimes academics feel like, you know, it's going to restrict their innovation. So we try to make sure that was open as possible, or it's just another process or forms they have to fill out, or that their discipline is particularly different to everything else, or they have the kind of expertise already. So I think those, although I was sort of joking about that experience, those are quite legitimate concerns. I think you kind of have to tread carefully around people's their own sense of identity and being a professional. I think one of the interesting things in the situation we're in now is, that might be interesting to discuss, is obviously we've just been through the pandemic, during which nearly everyone had to do some form of online learning. And I think what that's brought to the fore is that when you're in a physical campus and you're teaching, that architecture, the buildings and what else actually does a lot of that design work for you. So, you know, you need to turn up to a certain room at a certain time to get content in the form of a lecture. You go to another room at another time that's arranged with chairs around each other for a seminar, and you maybe go to another room, another building, the library, to access resources. It's all very structured, and you get lots of cues from the buildings about and the rooms about what you're supposed to do here. And then, you know, obviously there's other spaces for social interaction, cafes and bars, whatever. So when you move online, nearly all of those cues need to be designed in explicitly, and that takes a lot more time, a lot more thinking. And learning design is a means to help you do that kind of explicit activation of those cues that we take for granted elsewhere. But this does raise cost and resource issues, I think, for lots of higher education institutions, because they've got the kind of face-to-face model, which operates with a certain set of economic models, and the distance education model, such as we run at the University, operates on a different set of financial constraints. So for instance, our courses are often designed by teams, and we take a lot of time in the production mode, and then it's presented for several years. And that's a different cost model, I think, than a face-to-face university. So again, this kind of tension around how much of this stuff, how much of the kind of learning design approach can be adopted in different models in face-to-face universities that want to implement some online teaching. So I think we can think almost of levels of learning design. There's kind of, you don't need to go the whole learning design approach. Maybe it's just some elements you want to think about and adopt and use. And I think, having been through the online pivot, I know there's a big desire for many universities to be back to face-to-face teaching now. But I think also it's it's started a process that we're not going to stop now. I think, students have got used to having some things online now, and they don't want to necessarily give those up, whether that's online lectures or being able to get access to all their resources online from the library. So universities, I think, know that they need to move to a place where they're doing more online, more blended work, but it's difficult to get from here to there. And again, I think learning design is one process that allows you to make that transition. So that's it from me. Open for questions and comments. I'll share my slides afterwards so you can have all the links to those resources and stuff, but I'll stop sharing for now.
Oh, thank you very much, Martin. Loads of food for thought there. Wonderful that you're sharing. Are there any questions or comments? Eric?
No, nothing in the chat so far.
Any comments or questions from anyone else? If so, please just raise your hand. Here we go, Shorg, you go first.
Yeah, thank you, Martin, so much for your lovely presentation. And there's so much in there, and you working so professionally in this the Open University, and you showed those comments was from 2011, and you thought about and worked with this already. And can you help us here, those of us in the room and in the course which are not working in such a professional environment? We are maybe a single teacher. Can you help us making sense of this, and how, I mean, I can see there's a lot of things I can try to do this if I'm working on my own in my course to do this, but you might have some insights to make this transition.
Yeah,
we're not that happy or you're lucky to be in such a professional environment.
Yeah, I'm sure you're in a professional environment as well. I don't want to find it's unprofessional, but I think yeah, I think that's partly what I was trying to get at with the last slide. It's like, I'm not trying to say everybody has to become the Open University. That wouldn't be appropriate. So I think it's about finding the level of things you can do. So so maybe exploring some of those tools would be a good way to start. Just think about maybe that. I think the activity planner is always quite interesting. I don't want to create extra work for people, but I think it's one of those things that initially it's more work, but then it pays off further on, sort of down the road. So I think if you're thinking about delivering a course online or a blended approach, you want to maybe do something a bit different, not just deliver online lectures and face-to-face seminars, whatever. Then you might think, okay, what is it I want to teach? So I think that's the kind of question we asked with that those activity plans. Like, give yourself a step back from sort of rushing into committing to what it is, how you're going to teach it, rather, and thinking more about what is it I want to teach, and then what's the best way to teach those things. If I had a free range, it's like you can think then about your activity plan, and then maybe that's only for 1 week of your course, but at least it's a way in to start thinking about that, and just giving yourself some space to step back from the kind of continual mode of this is how we do things, this is how we always do it. I think, and that's exactly the struggle we had at the university. I think people knew how to design their courses, but those meetings would often start, right, we've got 10 printed units. How are we going to fill them up? Was kind of basically the question. But they're out of saying, like, are printed units the best thing to do for this? And I think we're just taking that step back. I hope that's what learning design gives you an opportunity to do. I think.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks very much, Maria.
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and very useful for us who are planning and executing courses. And I have actually 2 questions. One is a sort of a pettish question. It's about how you count the students' workload, knowing that it actually, I mean, how much time they spend on the course material, it really varies. And some are quick learners and some are more skilled. So is it some kind of average student you're you're thinking of?
In a way, yes. So there are some things we use, like we use kind of average reading speeds of people, and depending on the difficulty of the material, so you can give some average. But also then you are sort of, we actually, for a lot of the workload material, we got not the course team to estimate it, but rather the tutors, so the people who've been teaching that course for some time, and they have experience of working with the students. So they have some feel for how long this stuff actually takes students. I mean, you're right, there's a kind of an enormous variation, but within students, but often those tutors have a good feel for this activity you're asking people to do. You might think it takes an hour. Actually, it takes them 3-4 hours to do, because it takes a long time to understand what it is you're required to do, or anything that requires communication takes much longer to do. So in some ways it's a bit of a just guesswork, I think, but hopefully kind of like informed guesswork. But at least by having a model there, you're trying to think, okay, what is I want to be doing here? How long should that take? What's a good amount of time to allow for that? And we try to be sort of roughly generous as well with those timings. But obviously it will vary enormously for students and particular situations. But at least it's given you a feel for what the average workload is that you're trying to estimate for those students.
Yeah, because I think you can be a bit fooled by the 5.3, the exact.
Yeah.
It signals something that is very exactly calculated, but in reality it can't be. It's just an approximation. Yeah, that's one question. And the other question, I'm sorry to take up the time, but how do you relate your taxonomy to the the Bloom's revised taxonomy? Or do you in any way do that?
Yeah, so this is Gronya's work, really, and there is a relation. I think this is really trying to think much more about what's, in some ways, what's going on in the student's head, or if you were filming a student, what is it they would be doing at that time? They're producing something, they're writing. So it is trying to think back about not less of a kind of a teaching approach, more of a kind of student activity approach. But there is a relationship, and I think Gronya sets it out in her paper. But in some ways, I often say this about learning design, I don't think it really matters which model you choose, but just choose a model, I think. And then at least if you're all operating to the same model, then you know what people are, you've kind of got a universal language that you can talk about and discuss. And I think that there are many models of learning design. We did a lot of work in the UK with a JISC model, and everyone comes up with their own model. And I think we have those 6 categories, and some people say, I need 20 categories, or we should only have 4 categories. And we always argue about how many categories. But in some ways, it's not really, there is no like one genuine model that represents the truth that we're trying to uncover, but rather it's a way of having a shared language and thinking about the student activity.
I'm asking because the focus is not on how I want to teach, but rather on how I think students will best learn.
Yeah.
So slight shift in focus.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Maria. Anna, you can go ahead with your question.
Yes, I was wondering if you have any advice on how to provide feedback efficiently, since you mentioned about doing clear weeks and preferably giving a bit of feedback, informative assessment, but there's always limited time, limited resource, and online courses can be very huge. Have you got any top advice?
Yeah, it varies a lot. So we spend a lot of time on feedback for our students, because the assessment is kind of one of the main ways in which they get feedback and interaction with their tutor. So we spend a lot of time, we've got guides on how to give effective feedback and stuff, and often make it, and one of the things we really stress is feed forward. And it's like, so you've done this really well, and that's good to bear in mind for the next assignment where we'll be looking at these kind of things. So making them see some kind of journey. But often it's quite, I'm not a massive fan of artificial intelligence, automatic assessment, but often it's just a check for students, because they often feel quite lost. They're not having that kind of social interaction where you all go into the cafe afterwards and like, I didn't understand that. Did you understand that? So I think it's often just kind of fairly placing quite a lot of informal feedback throughout a module. That's like quizzes or whatever, or open-ended things that just give some feedback, just to make them feel as though it's okay. I'm not adrift. But I'm doing okay. And I think a lot of students need just that reassurance that they don't get as easily online when you're compared to face to face. So it can be fairly simple things. I've lots of reservations about multiple choice quizzes or whatever, but often those things they're not really there to be really testing learning. I think if you view them more as kind of giving students reassurance that they're doing okay and regular checks, then I think that's a good use of them.
Yeah, great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Eric, you had your hand up earlier. There is time for one last question if you'd like to put yours to Martin now.
Yeah, maybe it was already answered, but you can tell Martin. It was on this variation of workload and how come it could be so huge variation, because we all tried to have a smooth variation, but maybe you already explained that it's because
I think
of
it's
the wrong assessment of what.
I think it's easier to have a bigger variation in distance learning and online learning, because you're not structuring it so much around a 1 hour lecture plus so much reading time. You're trying to do different things, and by trying to do different things often in teaching, you can lead to a much greater variation. So I didn't mention this, but when we have those bar charts, the different activities, assimilative and so on, one of the things we did was feed that back to module teams, and often they would think that their module was very varied, but there'd often be a great big chunk of assimilative. It's like 80% of your course is assimilative, and that would be quite a shock for them. And I think it's a kind of implication that you want a variation across those activities, which is a good design thing to do, but it can lead then to uneven workloads, because it's not just a straightforward replication week after week. You're kind of doing different things, and so online group work inevitably takes a long time. I think it often takes longer. So not the variation is necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's necessary, and if students are producing assignments, that might take longer, but it's about trying to be aware of it. And I think sometimes when you're designing activities, and as you go through this kind of explicit mapping of student workload planning, then it's very easy to kind of think, that's okay, that we've got 3 activities this week, that looks about average, but actually one of those activities has 14 sub activities related to it, which take ages to complete, and actually before you know it, it's kind of cracked away from you, or there's a hangover from the previous week of work. So I think just having this design view just makes that just kind of foregrounds that. So it's, I think it's probably a product of the production focus of learning design, of module design that we used to have before we kind of brought it back to the kind of student-centered approach.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, Martin. It's been absolutely wonderful, and thank you. I know that your schedule is busy, so we're deeply appreciative of the time that you've given to the ONL community today. I know I take away your emphasis again on putting the student and student activity at the center and as an approach to learning design. And I always liked the activity planner and the learning design taxonomy that informs that. And then the use of analytics. I don't think that we're using analytics well enough in all cases. And I think there's a lot for us to draw from that. So thank you for the tools. Thank you for your time. I am going to ask everyone in the room before they leave if they could just respond to what you've learned about learning design from this webinar. Even if you put in 1 or 2 words, that feedback will be useful. So thank you everyone for your time. Martin, thank you. It's wonderful to have had you here today. Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Bye.